Welcome, everybody. It's late in the day, it's late in FII, but I know we are going to go out with a really interesting discussion. I've got a fantastic panel ahead of me, and thanks for sticking it out. First of all, I just want to thank Lakestar, who I believe is kind of behind putting this on. So for many people, we're at a pivot point. A revolutionary moment, if you will, that's akin to the Industrial Revolution. But in this time, it's deep tech, it's AI, it's quantum, it's blockchain. Others are at the center of today's revolution. I was doing some research for this, and I read this great comment. Deep tech is like the new oil. Like oil, it's at the center of geopolitical competition, with implications in defense, in infrastructure, in education, in the economy, and beyond. So what does this context mean for competition? What does it mean for collaboration? What does the future hold, and how can we harness it? What are the technologies we're not yet seeing? What areas are going to transform societies, and in what ways? What are the regulatory and policy frameworks that will facilitate this? We have a great panel in which to discuss this. On my immediate left, Dr. Joe Fitzsimmons, founder and CEO of Horizon Quantum Computing. Hi. Next to him, Dr. Klaus Hommels, founder and chairman of Lakestar and chairman of the NATO Innovation Fund, which I'd love to take you aside at some point and have a discussion on that. Daniel Metzer, on his left, the CEO and co-founder of ISAR Aerospace, and on his left, David Ulevich, general partner, Andreessen Horowitz. So fantastic panel, and I'm going to jump around a little bit to cover a lot of ground at the beginning, and then we'll go deep. And I want to start, if I could, with you, Klaus. You bring both a private sector and a government perspective on deep tech. What's driving investment on deep tech at the moment? And what are the respective interests of those two parties, and how do you get them to align?
Yes, thank you very much. So with the public sector, which you refer to the NATO Innovation Fund, yeah, I think it is not a miracle to guess what is driving the necessity for the defense technology. So basically, many people refer to it as defense technology, but at the end it is a deep tech technology where the state becomes, or the government becomes, the main client. So we assume that over the years now, with especially the sovereignty aspirations that Europe has, so volumes between 50 and 150 billion additional demand from the ministries of defense get into deep tech products, be it operating systems for drones and so forth. So this will be driven especially by experiences and phenomena that we have seen in the current warfare, where you have a very, very high asymmetry between the new technologies and the old technologies. So an old tank for 10 million can be taken out by a drone for 1,000 euro. So you will have to reassess where do you put the future investments as the Ministry of Defense. And since you get so much more mileage for the buck in the new technologies, so to say, then that is the main driver why the government, in this case the Ministries of Defense, are so keen to engage in this. Yeah? On the private side, of course, there are the biggest productivity gains to be achieved with technology and with deep tech, and this is why everybody tries first to go very, very deep into it, and secondly have a predominant role in certain sectors as it defines also their geopolitical power in the years to come.
And how do the two, just to follow on, how do the two work together? Because I can imagine there are circumstances in which the interests of the private sector and the interests of the public sector don't necessarily align. I mean, the obvious one is, the huge debate over the last 5 or so years in Google, for example, that when Google got involved in defense tech, which is perhaps a subset of deep tech, the Google staff objected. I mean, there was there's been the same, I think, is a true similar story for Microsoft. What happens when there's a friction between those, when the interests aren't aligned?
Yeah, look, at the end, everybody has his own set of ethical frameworks, which he wants to live by and which also limit the borders in which he wants to operate. Yeah, but there is some sheer necessity. Yeah, so the enemy won't kill itself. So in order to deter, you do have to basically also invest in technologies that help you deter, and that means there will be kinetic components to it. And then we have to see who wants to engage and wants to be involved of those. Yeah, there are very legitimate reasons why you can accept that for certain individuals, but there are also very legitimate reasons why certain individuals that have had a closer exposure to war scenes, yeah, are way more open and see the necessity to engage in these ones.
So wearing my geopolitical hat, I really want to follow down that little rabbit hole that is deterrence, because from a geopolitical perspective, we're really bad at it now, particularly in the technology space. But I'm going to resist the temptation for now. Perhaps we'll have time to come back to it. David, I want to come to you as an investor. What makes an effective deep tech business, or perhaps an effective deep tech founder, noting that you're sitting next to one? Maybe we'll come to him afterwards and say what makes you as effective as you are. But what makes an effective deep tech business or founder for you when you're looking to invest?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. Look, investing in these very, very difficult areas that have a huge amount of R&D cost and take a long time to often get to full commercial scale, to get to the revenue numbers that people would expect from a venture-backed company, which is how we invest as venture capitalists. You have to come up with milestones along the way, because it just takes so long to get to the finished commercial product. And so I think that there's a few things that I look for. One is that founders need to be incredible at all the things that they can control, because sometimes in the deep tech companies, there's a lot of things that are out of our control or take an incredible amount of time. So things they can control, they can be amazing at hiring and recruiting talent. You can be you have to be. If you look at someone like Elon Musk, people can say whatever they want about Elon, but he is incredible at attracting and materializing just incredible talent. He's also, the second thing you need is to be incredible at materializing capital. You have to be able to raise money. These are very, very expensive companies to build. And so a superpower for a founder and for a company needs to be able to materialize that incredible amount of capital. And so you have to be able to tell a great story. Those are the things that are needed as ingredients. The way that we measure the success is usually through milestones along the way. It's always possible, even if you're building something very, very, very difficult. Again, remember, I like to use SpaceX as a good example. Elon wants to go to Mars, but there's a lot of steps on the way that come along to building that launch vehicle, and Daniel certainly can talk about that. You have an engine, you have to deal with fuel issues, you have a whole bunch of regulatory issues. So there's milestones of progress along the way that we can look for to evaluate success. But I think that the thing that's most important about the founders in the deep tech space is, can they attract absolutely incredible talent, and can they attract capital?
And so let me just pick up on that second point, because you've got at least two entrepreneurs on stage here that I suspect want to know the answer to this, and you may even have some in the audience, which is, okay, so in a world in which it's a long-term investment, how do you attract capital when the investment is potentially measured in, and we're going to come to quantum in a second, but potentially measured in decades, multiple decades, and most investors are looking at a kind of 3 to 5 year time horizon. So how do you square that particular circle?
I think the best, is this for me?
Yeah, go ahead. If Klaus has something to add, I suspect there's a lot of people who are
the best founders are the best storytellers.
Okay.
And they connect this really complicated technology to an outcome of how it will transform the world, how it will create immense value. So it's one thing to say that, quantum is really a hard technology, it's a hard thing, AI is really hard, but how do these things transform our lives? What is the economic impact of these things? And narrating and crafting a story around that is I think what attracts, it actually solves all problems. It attracts great talent, it attracts capital, and it makes the public more aware and interested in what you're doing.
So I'm going to come back to that idea, and I'll give you fair warning, because I quite like to hear if you had to give the audience one narrative, maybe 3 sentences, 4 sentences on how you think deep tech is going to impact our lives over the long term. What is that narrative? I'm going to
Can I first jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you said people want to have an investment horizon of 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
This is a little bit an illusion. So and it's also sometimes strange how we perceive time. So every company that builds a mold which is very valuable, it takes 10, 15 years, right? And 10, 15 years, if you extrapolate it and say, oh, look, this is 2040, then you faint. But if you say 14 years back is 2013, then you say, hey, that was yesterday, or that's 2010, that was around the corner. So it is a little bit of perception. Yeah? And if you really want to go big on companies and trends, so iPhone is like 20 years back, or not even. So, and this, you need to look for these secular trends, and that's why talking about AI and deep tech, these are all secular trends. So they will build ecosystems, and they will build a lot of adjacent businesses. So the time horizon for me is the least of the problems here. So if you identify the right secular trend, I think then you are in front of the wave and in a good place.
So many things I want to dig into. You want to say something?
Briefly
And then I'll come
adding,
to you, Joe.
a seed investor also doesn't necessarily need to be able to sustain for 15 years, right? Mm-hmm. So at some point you start hitting milestones, you start recycling some of the investors and shareholders, and it's perfectly fine. So some of the early ones get their returns, you bring in later stage investors, PE firms, family offices, and you basically continue while making everyone happy.
As long as you're continuing to show growth, as defined by
growth, progress, of course. You got to hit milestones.
Okay, so I'm gonna come back to you if I can, but let me ask Joe, quantum. Now we've been talking about quantum and I'm not in the tech space, and I know we've been talking about quantum for at least 20 years, which means we've probably been talking about quantum for at least 40 years. Talk to us a little bit. Are we close to a pivot moment now? And if we are close to a pivot moment, what does that pivot look like? So, this is a panel on not just deep tech, but deep tech and how it's going to affect our lives. So, what global challenges is it going to address? Are we close to a pivot point? And if so, what does it look like on the other side?
So, we are getting towards a pivot point with quantum computing. That's pretty clear. We've known about quantum computing since the 80s. We've had the first real algorithms since the 90s. And the first attempt to build quantum computers in the late 90s, around 1998. And I've been in quantum computing since 2004, so I have been talking about this for 20 years. But what I would say is that we have seen enormous progress. We have gone from a period where quantum computing, the complexity of the processors was doubling once every 5 years for about 20 years. And 2016, that changed. The investment of private capital, as it started moving towards industry, we started to see progress where the complexity of the chips started doubling not once every 5 years, but once every 8 to 9 months. And that's been sustained up to today. So we've gone from a position where the first commercial processors were around 5 qubits in 2016. We see more than 1,000 qubits, 1,100 qubits today, which is about the same number as bits in an Atari 2600. And we've started to see error correction for the first time. So what has really stopped quantum computing from being useful is the fact that the processors are dominated by random errors. So every time you try to do an operation, 1 time in 100 you get an error. And we really need to get that much, much lower. So 27th of August of this year, we saw the first demonstration of error correction for the first time, where it's multi-round error correction, detecting an error, correcting it, and repeating the process over and over again. and getting better performance out of the chip as a result. So we're only kind of 8 weeks post that.
Okay.
So we're really entering a new regime for quantum computing. I think, you know, if you ask me, I'd say we're still about 3 years off seeing really useful quantum computers, but we're definitely moving and moving very quickly. You asked what life is like after that, post-quantum computing. What I really liked your oil analogy earlier about deep tech being like oil. And another thing that I think is a little bit like a resource, maybe not oil, but like renewables, is knowledge. So each different bit of knowledge you get enables you to do something new, and it's kind of an infinitely renewable resource. So we've entered this era now where we can use machines to generate knowledge, whether that be extracting insights from data at scale, whether it be through simulation of physical systems around us, or now in the age of AI with protein folding, for example, where we've seen a Nobel Prize awarded, and other areas. So what I think is really interesting in deep tech in particular is the ability to generate new knowledge. All deep tech companies are generating new knowledge to some extent. That's kind of what makes them deep tech companies. But a lot of these are not just generating new knowledge, but accelerating the way we generate knowledge, allowing us to generate more knowledge faster. I think quantum computing is a very clear example of this. Just as GPUs have allowed the acceleration we need to start implementing large language models and things like this, the change that quantum computing brings is many, many times that.
So, and again, I mean, I know I'm stacking questions, which a moderator should never do, but there's a really interesting, the way you've just described it, Joe, of less educated audience, perhaps not the people here, but certainly me. I would love it if at some point we could cover some, okay, so again, what does it look like? What are the possibilities? How will life be different? How will my life be different 15 years from now because of some of the things that we're talking about on stage? But before we get there, because I was talking to somebody earlier on space, talk to us a little bit about space. Earlier yesterday, I was on a panel and we were talking about the possibilities of access to new natural resources because of a kind of transformation in terms of our access to space. And I think Tibor probably is here somewhere or will be listening. So tell us a little bit, because that's your area, right? So tell us a little bit about how you think space fits into this picture, fits into this equation. How is it transforming? What should we know?
Space is interesting because it's, from a tech platform perspective, very similar to the internet. And we're right now in the space industry at a point where the internet was about 20 years ago. Technologically, pretty much everything is possible. People now start actually getting very creative at building use cases. So for example, detecting new rare earth metals, for example. You can take a hyperspectral satellite and actually start analyzing what is the ground made up of. So you don't literally walk around trying to find rare earth metals, but the satellite is doing it, and the satellite is going around the planet every 1.5 hours. So you basically do a global mapping instantly. So it's going to entirely change the mining industry. But at the same time, it's going to change the telco industry because you can now literally get your internet from space directly with no ground infrastructure, basically. So plug your small antenna into a power outlet, and that's it. And so space will disrupt, I think, pretty much every other industry, starting from insurance. And if you live in the US, California, for example, in most of the parts, you can't even buy a home insurance because of the risk of wildfires. So no insurance actually has even the data set to even actually offer you an insurance. So now out of a sudden, there's space companies saying, hey, I can actually become an insurance company because I do have all of the data. So out of a sudden, as a space company, you start actually disrupting the entire insurance industry. So space will basically go into every other branch of our daily lives. And I think it's very exciting years ahead of us.
So I do believe it is most underrated. The more you you deal with it and you learn about it, the more it becomes clear what it will all change and how high the necessity will be. So imagine that with hypersonic warheads and which carry nuclear, the reaction time for the US president would be like 12 minutes. So, and there is no chance that you will be able to react on those things without having some kind of space optionalities here. Yeah? So we see that you can grow organs in the vacuum that you would not be able to do here. So there are more and more verticals to engage in. And the beauty that a business like ESA Aerospace has, it will be sort of a monopolist in Europe. Currently, the transport capacity is sold out for 6 years. So there is a lot of economical power that you can derive out of this special situation here.
So I want to take a step back, because what you've described in quantum computing, if just taken alone as a standalone, is transformative. I mean, that's kind of what deep tech's about, space, transformative. And the way you've described it in both cases is that it is integrated into everything, in a sense. And these things build on one another. So what is the framework that we as humans, we as investors, we as entrepreneurs, how should we be thinking about this in terms of realizing the opportunity that that the world is giving us? How do we think about what the world is looking like? How do we, as I say, what's the framework that allows us to think about it?
So, these are sometimes very tiny things. So when you think back, the existence of Netflix was the invention of the DVD, because the former VHS cassettes didn't fit into a mailbox. Mm-hmm. So this was a very tiny innovation. Because you had that, you suddenly had the initial Netflix model that you could send around DVDs. So, and all these little new technologies come all together and then give us the opportunities of new business models, meaning getting a real 1.5 hour update on every place on Earth for climate, for wind, for weather. This is huge. So, and we don't know what it all will have for consequences and optionalities.
So I understand that, and I'm trying to think of the right analogy. What you're describing is a space that is unimaginable. Maybe that's the right way of thinking about it. The future is unimaginable. We don't have the capacity. So as investors...
Yeah, I think I would say there's no framework to fully explain the future, right? Because it's unknown. But if you sort of divide the world, I like to think as like there's builders in the world and there's destroyers. And there's science that has always advanced us. It's saved lives, increased longevity, reduced food malnutrition, given us a higher quality of life. It's advanced our ability to understand the world around us. So like if you're in the world of the builders, you generally are looking toward what can the future be, the endless possibility. So when I hear about space, I'm not a space expert, but I'm a builder, and I get very excited. What can the space economy unleash? Whether it's imaging back of Earth, whether it's better national security and defense, whether it's ability to manufacture things and do mining in space, like a whole new world. Like just like when America was fully built out and we had trade and agriculture in the U.S. going back to Europe, like once I feel like we can get into space, like we're getting into space easily now. Once we can get back from space, that'll be very exciting. We're going to have a whole lot of possibility once we're going back and forth from space all the time. Maybe we become a multi-planetary species. Maybe we have a whole economy in space. And the same is true for quantum. Once these things enter our world, it's impossible. In fact, I would say as a builder, like it's impossible to even imagine how big these things get. And another good example is like Uber. If you had, and this is a classic example, if you had imagined all of the, the black chauffeur cars in that market, it didn't seem very big when Uber first started. But then all of a sudden you have the food delivery services, you have the rideshare services, you've created a whole economy for drivers, for messengers. Like it's really been transformative but never would you have imagined how big it could have ever become.
Okay, so let's not aspire to looking 5 or 10 years out. Let's aspire to looking a year out or 6 months out for a moment. For the two kind of investors and the two builders, you're all builders, on the panel, give me a short. What does 6 months out look like? What is the most exciting probability you see for 6 months out?
Well, maybe Daniel. I mean, 6 months is such a short time frame.
Yeah, you choose in the short term, and whatever you want to define as your short term. What is it that you're looking at investing in? You go, that's the one that I think is underrated, but that is.
AI is real today, and it is transforming every single industry, whether it's transforming the jobs themselves. So the example is, if you were an enterprise software investor, you may have looked at call center software before, you may have looked at software for healthcare, but now you're actually looking at things that replace the call center people, replacing the job of nurses to call and remind you to take your medication. It is truly disrupting industries.
So for you, it's AI and
I would
AI
say
and
AI in
everything.
every single industry, mining,
Okay.
enterprise software, anywhere.
I'm going to be out of a job as a moderator. Okay, what else?
So look, I think it's very interesting what Daniel Ek does with his new company NECO, which is preemptive medicine. So I think the the way how he scans your body and analyzes the data is in a sense that you and I, we might have a very healthy DNA set now, and he can see that somebody who was in a similar situation got diabetes in 10 years. So, and this helps you to have precautionary diets and sport programs. So these are step change progress that it's very difficult to imagine now. So you do a full body scan with blood pressure with new sensors. You just lay on a bed, you don't get all these cables. So these are with 1,000 times more data, you will be looking at your health and optimizing your whole well-being.
Phenomenal. How about for you two? Go ahead.
I don't believe in overnight success, especially not in deep tech.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's
We've told
by
it's a long
definition,
term.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, because you want also defendable tech. If someone can disrupt your own business in 6 months, then it's not really defendable.
Okay.
So, if I look at 6 months, basically it's just a continuation of what we've seen the last probably 2 to 3 years, which is an exponential curve of numbers of satellites, for example, put to space, and the amount of businesses built on top of space infrastructure. So once, again, you put those tools into the hands of people, like, for example, Apple put the App Store into the hands of people to actually create apps. Apple could have never come up with all of those apps. But once you put those into the hands of people, that's really where there's a pivotal change. And the more satellites are up there, the more abundant data becomes from space, the more real-time it becomes. That's when it really kicks off.
I think of the word catalyst or facilitator. That's what you're creating. You're
Correct.
creating a.
On the other side, you also have to see the downside. What if you actually don't do it?
Yeah.
You'll take, Klaus briefly mentioned, especially out of Europe, but pretty much, I would almost say everything outside of Elon Musk's world, there's basically no access to space. So if the kingdom wants to launch a satellite next year, they just can't.
Yeah.
Because there's no rocket. So even if you want to play, you have to ensure early enough that you actually put your bets and you basically get yourself access, because it will pay off 3, 5, 10 years later. There's a big compounding effect on top of it. But you have to have a bit of a vision and a bit of foresight.
I want to come back to this, but I want to get Joe to have an opportunity to.
Yeah, actually, there's two things I can say. The first that's been very impactful on us directly is an emerging open stack in quantum computing. So we are a software company, we make software development tools, but we've now taken the step of putting together our own hardware testbed, because it turns out quantum computing has reached the stage where you can buy a processor from one company, buy control systems from another, buy a fridge from another, and integrate them and have it on-prem. And that really opens a lot of doors for us in terms of having full control over the entire hardware stack. However, I would like to absolutely agree with what David said. We keep quite a tight eye on artificial intelligence. we have a team internally that has been experimenting with using it for using agents for scientific workflow. It turns out there's still a lot of limitations. So one of the metrics we use internally is trying to get transformer models to solve things like Sudokus. It turns out that GPT cannot solve Sudokus just because of the way it works, and because even if you use chain of thought, the number of different steps that are required to solve it, you have an error occur early on and it just sends it off on the wrong path. You just do not get correct results out. But it turns out you can take quite a lot of steps to mitigate these. The models are actually getting to the point where you can use them to error correct one another and actually ensure much higher levels of correctness with them. And I think next 6 months, that's something where we'll see a lot of progress. And in fact, we already see it with OpenAI and O1.
So I want to flip us for the last few minutes into a slightly different topic, because you talked about builders and destroyers. You said something similar, slightly different language. You're working on security, and we started in a conversation on security. How do you, how do you integrate those two things? How do you protect against the destroyers? Well, let me put it a slightly different question. How is the fact that the world is becoming more regionalized, that you've got tensions between two of the greatest tech powers out there, the United States and China, that collaboration is very, very hard to do, that you're having walls put up rather than bridges, and that's the direction that we're going in a geopolitical space? How is that affecting what's going to happen and how you do what you do?
Just quickly, I would say, I don't even count destroy. It's easy to think of builders and destroyers as like one nation versus another nation or another nation, but destroyers are like the people that are against technological advancement, against AI development, against quantum development, the people that don't want us to explore space, that tear down someone like Elon Musk, who, as Daniel said, is making space accessible for those that want it. The destroyers are the regulators who are calcified in their buildings and are afraid to allow progress to be made. The destroyers are really these people that have forgotten about intellectual curiosity and experimentation and taking risks. Those are the destroyers that I think are the greatest threat. So it's not really such an answer to your question, but I think the dynamic when we talk about humanity is how do we get the destroyers to really think more broadly and more optimistically about the future?
But destroyers are implicit, because if you have Standard & Poor's, so the half-life time of a company once was 35 years, now it has gone down to 13 years. That means that basically 7% of the index is swapped every year. So that means new technologies go in and old go out. The old are the losers, they lose out, and the new ones are the ones which have the future. So this is an antagonism where people fight for their existence, and I think that's a very, very normal thing. So historically it has been proven this a useless fight to try to prevent or to not promote technology to grow, because you just prolong your life, but that you don't change the odds. So I think it is the way every state has become rich is by financing innovation in the 4-5% of GDP. So, and this is the secret, and that's why I think it is instrumental to be the builder and to promote the builder, because they will make the difference, and then the entire society will profit from that.
But there are many. Go ahead.
Just maybe to also add on what David said, to maybe use in a bit different words. There's basically people who do and those who don't do, or maybe even the ones who actively block. Mm-hmm. So people have to figure out which category do they classify themselves in. Are they doers, or are they not doers or even blockers? And so if you classify yourself as a doer, the question is, what are you actually doing? And then we're coming back to actually tech capability as well of, can you even do it? Can you even send a satellite to space? Can you even power up a nuclear fusion plant? Can you even use quantum computers because you have access? Even if you want to, but you don't have access to it, you're automatically classified as a whole, oftentimes as an entire country, into the box of not doers, not because you don't want to, but because you just can't. So I think we'll see a lot more drive towards the whole sovereignty element, because people want to be their own driver. They want to decide for themselves, do I want to play in it or not?
Joe, any thoughts on this? As a doer?
I mean, you know, we went through a process a little while ago within the company. We found that there were different things that caused friction within the company. And one of the things that caused friction would be people that wouldn't take action or would reach a barrier and stop at the barrier. And really, we need people to tear down the barrier so that others can pass. So we formulated a list of core principles, and this is really the most important one. It's the most important one that we judge people on in performance reviews within the company. We have a core principle that says, drive progress and get your hands dirty. And that is really one of only 4 metrics we measure people by at performance reviews and so on. I think it is critically important to science to progress in general.
Thank you all. It's been a fascinating conversation. I can't help, having spent 30 years in geopolitics, sit here not as a blocker, I'd like to think. I'd like to think of myself as a doer, but also there's a whole set of voices behind me that goes, we want to do, but we want them not to do. And that's a threat to me. And I love the fact that for the people sitting next to me, you're kind of almost saying, you know what, we're moving too fast and we're doing too much and I don't have time for you. I'm just getting on with my thing. And I actually kind of like that, you know. And I hope that lots of those people don't get in the way. Because what you have described for me is a transformed world that I only have a little taste of on the tip of my tongue, and I wish I had more time to get a better flavor. But will you all join me? Thank you so much for hanging around, and thank you to our panel.